In this testing Oracle EBS video, I'll go over how I would approach testing approval workflows. Approval workflows can happen in many different areas of EBS. The most popular would be in procurement, either for the purchase order or for the requisition, but you also have some in uh, GL for journal entries and also in projects for either creating a project or approving a budget. Uh, for simplicity's sake, I think we should take a look at the GL journal um, workflow and see how we can test that. So in our first step, we need to gather some information. So the information we need to gather is what process happens in EBS to actually trigger the workflow. And then we need to find the inputs of the workflow, what are the different data states of those inputs, and what are the different outputs of the workflow. And then if there's any setup steps that are required to initiate the workflow or to have it route to the correct person that we want to test it for. So in our first example of the GL approval workflow, it's triggered when you click on the Approve button for the journal batch. That will kick off the workflow, and it will use some information from the journal entry and some setups to go through and figure out who needs to approve it and then send that notification. So for the inputs of the workflow, we're looking at who's preparing the journal entry, what's the username, and that username is attached to an employee, so that's how it links in who's the preparer, and then it uses the employee record to figure out who's the employee's supervisor and the director and all the way up the management chain. In GL, there's some approval limits for each of the people that are in the management chain. So your supervisor may only be able to approve up to a certain dollar amount, and your director to another dollar amount, and then it goes up and up. Now, how does the workflow determine the amount of the journal? Well, if debits equal credits, then they subtract from each other. Every journal is 0. But what it does is it looks at each line on the journal entry, and then it determines based on that line, the largest line, the absolute value of the largest line, who should be approving it based on their limit. And not every journal entry is subject to this approval. That's controlled through a journal flag or approval flag on the journal source. So now that we know our inputs, let's take a look at the data states of each input. So this is very important in testing, is to figure out what different flavors of the data, and based on that, there's going to be a different output. So for example, we'll take the journal entry, the user that's entering the journal entry. Now that person in the system can be either valid or invalid. So that's very easy. When we're looking at data states, we can always say something is valid, invalid. But we need to further define what invalid means later. But for right now, we can just say, well, we want to test to make sure that if it's a valid user, it's going to do one thing. If it's an invalid user, it's either going to do the same thing or it's going to do something different. So we have our different data states. So we have our journal entry user. We have the approver. So that's in the management chain. So the approver can either exist or it can be missing. So if I have an employee record that doesn't have a supervisor, then there's no one to send the journal entry to. And then the last thing, or the next thing, is the approver, the approver's limit. So the approver's limit, there could be none. So it goes to the approver limit table, doesn't find anything. Or it can be less than the journal line. It can be exactly the same or more. So the approver's limit has 4 different data states that we can say. The value of the journal line is the next data element, and that can either be a positive number or a negative number. And then finally, the journal source flag can either be require approval or not require approval, so a yes, no. So based on these different outputs, we come up with the different inputs, we can come out with different outputs. So what happens when the approvers is missing? Well, it should send a notification back to the preparer saying we can't find an approver. So if everything works perfectly, it's going to send a notification to the approver. If things don't work out and it fails, and through the workflow, it should send a notification back to the preparer. So for each of the data states, I've outlined a different expected output. Now that we have our inputs and our expected outputs, we can go to the next step, which is developing our test scripts and cases. So we need to find the data that fits this state, and that's what I was talking about earlier. When there's an invalid user, what do we mean by that? What data are we looking for in a user record or employee record that would make that invalid? Now, the data that we find that we're looking for in the system can either be developed by us or created by us on the fly as we're testing. We can go in and create a new user and make sure it's exactly the way we want it, and then use that in our test. Or we can have a script that goes out and queries and finds this information and says, oh, find a user that's like this, and then we'll use that. Or we can just say, we already know the value, it's always going to be this, therefore we're going to just plug this in. So for example, in the journal entry line amount, we can just say, oh, we need a positive and a negative amount. So we'll use these amounts. So once we find the data that fits each state, we need to look at what's the default for each input. So here, when we're going through each of the data states, we only want to test that data state and keep everything else constant. We don't want to mix and match too much because the expected outcome could be different. So we want to test that specific part of the logic by keeping all the other variables constant or in a default. Once we have that, we can populate the data for each test case and then start looking at our validation process. So here's an example of our test data and what I would come up with. So I have the input, the data state, and then where am I going to get this information from? What am I going to create a script that's going to do it, or am I going to hard code it? And I went through each one and I said, okay, I'm going to have scripts for these and constants for these. Then I looked at, well, what would be the default values? So if I wanted this workflow to go through perfectly, I would have a valid user, there would be an approver in the management chain, the approver limit would be higher than the journal amount, the journal line would be positive, and the journal source flag would be required. So this is kind of our most likely scenario when we're in production, and we want to test this, and we're going to set these as the default. So when we start manipulating our test cases, we can keep all these other variables static, and it's going to look something like this. So as we populate our test case, you can see our first test case is what I just described, kind of our basic scenario. The second one, we're going to have an invalid preparer user. So the first data element, the journal entry preparer user, we're going to make that invalid, but we're going to keep all the other data elements the same. That way we're just testing that if this is invalid, I'm expecting this thing to happen. And we're going to keep changing the data elements as we go through this matrix until we've reached all and covered all the different data inputs, and therefore we've covered all the different logic that happens in the program. So once we have our test case matrix laid out, we need to look at what's the validation. So for some of these, we're going to need to look for a notification and see if the program sent the notification if, hey, you need to approve this journal entry. So our validation scripts are going to be based on the 3 expected outputs that we're going to have. We're either going to have the workflow sends the notifications to the correct user, the workflow sends a notification back to the preparer, or it doesn't launch at all, which is one of our test cases. If we have a journal source that doesn't require approval, well, it's not going to do anything. So we need to check that. So the validation process would be, for the first 2, would be to log into Oracle and view the notification. So that would be a script that we would need to write to check to see if the notification is there. And the last one, if the workflow is not supposed to launch, we'll go in, we'll check the journal entry status, and it should be not requiring approval because that's the source said. So now that we have our test cases, our data, and our validation scripts, we can put it all together, and you can see that each test case has a series of scripts that we would run. So for the first one, which is our basic vanilla, most likely scenario in the production world, we're going to say the approver exists with a high limit. So the first script we're going to run is a login to application. The second script is we'll find the user supervisor. The third script is we're going to update that supervisor's approval limit to a very high amount so we can, when we create a journal entry, we're assured that that's the one it's going to pick. Script number 4 is we create a journal entry. Script number 5 is we submit it for approval. And script number 6 is we verify that the supervisor got the notification. So as you can see in this matrix of the scripts, we have a lot of duplication of the different scripts. So we can leverage each one differently as we go through it. The data might be different, but the actual script itself would be the same. We just need to substitute the right values for the data as it goes through each test case. So this is an example of how I would approach testing a workflow. It's somewhat complicated because you're logging in and out of the system and different users. And if this is something that you're interested in us doing for you, please click the Contact Us button and we can set up a meeting and see how we can help you out. Thank you.